Hello everyone, it's Greg from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy here. In today's video I'm going to talk about some less typical swords which were historically used in Europe. So if you're watching this, then chances are you're a sword enthusiast and quite possibly some kind of fencer as well. So you're probably familiar with the standard categories of weapons which are used in the modern HEMA scene. For example, if you study late Renaissance stuff, I'm sure you know what a side sword, what a rapier, what a back sword are. And if you study later stuff, I'm sure you're familiar with small swords, spadroons, broadswords, and sabres. However, in fact, historically, there were lots of other swords in use as well, which do not neatly fit into these categories. So I thought it would be fun and interesting today to look at a few examples of these. I'm going to show you a number of pictures. Some of these are my own personal photos, and some of them are things I've borrowed from museum catalogues. Let's get into it. Our first sword is this one. It originates in southern Germany sometime in the first half of the 17th century, but really it represents a broad category of weapons which were very popular all across Western Europe throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. As you can see, it has a relatively simple hilt. These weapons sometimes have a single side ring to protect the hand, or sometimes not, as in this case, and there are variations in the designs of the quillons and the pommel and so on. However, the important thing is the blade of the weapon is only around 80 centimeters long and double-edged. So these swords were mass-produced for issuing to soldiers as standard sidearms. So they were munitions quality weapons. Now, I don't think we can really call these side swords because the hilt is a little bit too simple and the blade is actually a different size and shape from the classic side sword model which we can see portrayed in Achille Marozzo's fencing treatise, for example. So this is something different. Most modern collectors seem to refer to these generically as infantry swords. The only period term I can think of which comes close to being suitable is a brief mention in George Silver's English fencing treatise of the late 1500s, where he talks about the use of the short sword. And I think that's a pretty apt name for this. But anyway, they don't really seem to have an official name, despite being very common. This next weapon is also a very short one, probably comparable in length to the previous example. This type of sword was specifically popular in and around Venice in northern Italy. Now, as you can see, these weapons are really broad at the forte, but taper to quite a nasty point, I would say, and they are usually very highly decorated. An indication of them being a high status weapon. Now typically these are referred to with the term cinquedea, which translates roughly to a 5-finger sword, in other words a sword which is 5 fingers broad or wide at forte. So yeah, there you go. How was this sword used in fencing? What sort of person carried it and in what circumstances? I don't know. It's never discussed in any fencing treatise that I know of, and in fact I'm not even aware of its portrayal in any kind of artwork from the period. And yet there are quite a few of these surviving in museum collections around Europe. So I think that's pretty interesting. So this one is another Italian sword with a rather unusual hilt, which looks a little bit like a crab. And collectors often refer to it as a crab claw hilted sword or crab claw sword. The blade on it is a pretty typical medium length double-edged cut and thrust blade. It's of the same proportions as a side sword. However, the hilt is pretty different from a side sword blade. And in fact, you can't hold this with the 4-finger grip, which is shown in all of the classic side sword treatises. So I'm not really sure we could call this a side sword. In fact, I don't really know what to call it. I'm also not sure what this weapon was really for. The hilt is somewhat elaborate, and yet there isn't a lot of decoration on it, so there's no gold engraving or anything like that. So it doesn't seem to be a really high status weapon, but it also doesn't really look like a munitions quality weapon. My best guess is that it is some kind of sidearm for a soldier, but a higher quality one than the earlier example we saw. But in all honesty, who knows? Okay, I was lucky enough to be able to handle this sword in a museum collection. It's of 16th century German origin. Now, looking at this picture, you probably think, well, I know what this one is. It's clearly a rapier. It's got some kind of swept hilt and a long, narrow thrusting blade. However, the thing about this blade is it's actually got a really thick triangular section blade. So it looks like a really heavy duty version of the later smallsword blades. It has little or no cutting capability at all, but it's very rigid. This is actually an example of a military sword, primarily for cavalry soldiers. And the blade is essentially a spike for punching through the gaps in armour. So this is what would be called generally an estoc in Western Europe, although in Germanic Europe they often just use the term Reiterschwert, meaning cavalry sword. There's also an English language term from the 16th century, tuck, which I suppose is etymologically related to estoc, and often refers to a thrusting sword. I'm not sure if tuck applies to this type of military weapon or if it's intended to mean a rapier, but anyway, there you go. So is this a type of rapier? Is the estoc a rapier in fact, or is it something different? I'll leave that up to you to decide. This design of sword is a favourite amongst modern sword collectors. So this is an Italian weapon, although it has its origins in southeastern Europe somewhere. So the sword is often referred to as a schiavona, meaning a Slavonic sword. So the history behind this is a much simpler form of this sword was in common use in parts of Central and Southeastern Europe in the late medieval period. And then the weapon was imported into Italy by Balkan mercenaries during the 16th century, hence Slavonic sword. But Italian swordsmiths went about embellishing the basic design, and this is the fully developed form of it with this elaborate mesh or basket protecting the hand. So the blade's a medium length double-edged cut and thrust blade. In form, the weapon bears some similarity to the basket-hilted backswords and broadswords, which were popular in Northern Europe. However, this weapon did develop in isolation from that. And I should also note that the weapon can be wielded with the forefinger grip, so the forefinger over the quillon, in the classic Italian style associated with side swords and rapiers. The only reference I've found to this in a treatise is a visual one, so Angelo Vigiani's mid-16th century treatise appears to show a couple of fencers wielding this sort of weapon, although the other fencers in his work are armed with what look like classic side swords. How would you categorize this weapon? Is it a broadsword? Is it a side sword? Is it something different and unique? I don't know. Apologies for the reflections in this photo. It's one of my own crude attempts to picture something from a museum. Anyway, a quick glance at this weapon will probably give you the idea that it's some kind of rapier. And that's from the hilt design, which in fact looks like a shell-hilted weapon of the mid-17th century. However, if you look closely at the blade, you'll see that it's actually quite broad and flat. So it's much more of a cut and thrust blade, and is actually quite similar to a broadsword blade in its form. This sort of weapon was extremely common in northern Germany and the Netherlands during the period of the 30 Years' War, so broadly the first half of the 17th century. Now, most museum collections seem to categorize these weapons as being cavalry broadswords. I'm not sure what the basis for that is. I don't particularly see any reason why this needs to be a cavalry sword, but I don't know, maybe they have some evidence for that. The blade is relatively broad, but I mean, it's clearly designed to be held in the manner of a rapier with the forefinger looped over the quillons. So I'm not really sure what the best way to designate this weapon is. Is it a broadsword? Is it a rapier? Is it a cavalry weapon, or a more general purpose sidearm, or even a primary arm? Again, I don't really know. Okay, this is actually a famous sword which is held in the Smithsonian Museum over in the United States. This was the personal sword of George Washington, famous military commander and first president of the United States. So he carried this when he was an officer in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. So as you can see, it's a medium-sized weapon with a fairly small hilt, a moderately curved single-edged blade, and a little decoration, but not too much. So this was definitely a sidearm. But what is this weapon? It bears a little resemblance to the earlier medieval and Renaissance falchions and messers, but it's actually from a different period of history and doesn't look exactly like them. And just looking at the blade, you might think of it as being a saber, but it's not really a saber either. So modern sword collectors tend to refer to these weapons rather generically as hangers. In other words, they're weapons that hang at your side when you're doing something else, like commanding troops or hunting and so on. So yeah, this is an officer's hanger. Okay, this one is an Austrian sword from, I believe, the early 19th century. At first glance, you would probably think of this as being a saber. And in fact, it is a sword specifically designed for the cavalry. However, most people would associate sabers with having curved blades. In fact, this sword, as you can see, has a straight, flat blade, more like a broadsword, but with a fairly tapering tip on it, which could give a nasty thrust as well. This type of weapon was actually known as a palash in Central Europe. The term is of somewhat obscure origin. Some people seem to believe it originally came from Hungary and then was adapted to the German language. Other people point to perhaps a Turkish origin in the term. I don't really know. However, this is technically not a saber, it is a palash. Okay, our final example is another cavalry sword. So this is the 1913 Patton model cavalry sword from the United States military. So the First World War era cavalry weapon of choice for them. Again, just looking at this, you'd think, well, presumably this is a saber, as it's a cavalry sword, and indeed the hilt is a fairly classic saber design for that era. But look at the blade, medium length, but very narrow, double-edged, and with this elongated point. And the weapon has a little cutting capacity, but is basically designed as a thrusting sword. Now, most people's definition of a saber is a weapon with a curved, single-edged cutting blade. So is it right to classify this as a saber? I believe that the American military manuals of the period actually do refer to it as a saber, but it doesn't actually fit that description at all. It's really a thrusting sword. So there you go. That really brings us to the end of today's video, but I think it's a suitable example to finish on. Categorization of swords is actually quite difficult, and although the big general categories we use within historical fencing and HEMA, like rapier and side sword and saber and so on, are pretty useful to facilitate communication, we should remember that actually there were a huge variety of swords out there in use in historical Europe and North America as well, as we have seen. So it's not always easy to fit weapons neatly into one category or the other. And this is a suitable point to remind you all as well that in the majority of fencing treatises, the masters refer to the primary weapon that they use simply as a sword, and often don't waste time trying to categorize the type of sword. I hope you found today's video enjoyable and interesting. I'll leave it there, and we'll return in the near future with another video. Take care, everyone. Bye.